Greetings, everyone. Koku here. I see Daily Affirmations by Pauline is in the chat saying good evening. Good evening to Daily Affirmations by Pauline. You guys make sure to check out her channel. Check out her book that's out right now. Make sure to subscribe and follow her on other forms of social media as well. Always has a uplifting word for the folks every day. We're reading a paper tonight called African Nationalism, Concept or Confusion. And it's something that I realize that we are so scattered on these concepts that I don't know what's going to really happen with us in the future. And I'm not saying that to be dour. I'm just being realistic. I saw a thread today on Twitter where the thread was something like what was it again? Hold on. The thread on Twitter today was about black nationalism. And it was about giving your most radical take or something along those lines. And I looked at the responses, man, and it's like, if you think that thing and the other thing is a problem for us to achieve, then what will we ever achieve? If we get enough of you around, right? What will we ever achieve? I'm trying to find this thread again, and I cannot find it right now on the fly. So you're just gonna have to believe me. Oh yeah, here it is. It says controversial takes, Black Nationalist Edition. And it's just, I mean, all over the place. Some of it is good stuff. Some of it is some things that is wild to me. But so that led me to want to ask this question, and I posted this question on the community tab tonight. Is African nationalism a legit concept or just confusion? Is it a legit concept or just confusion? So you guys can it's a poll. You guys could answer that on the community tab. So we're going to read this paper tonight. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. We're going to start the show now, and we're going to start the show, and on the other side, we'll begin the reading of this paper.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Just want to remind you guys before we get the show rolling that this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows on the network you are invited to tune into.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. I am your host, Koku. I see the pro-black perspective has joined us, and we in here. So, a part of the reason why we're reading this paper is because of that black nationalist tweet and some of the retweets and responses to it on Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter, and you should be, it's @bittermeds, MEDZ. You guys should be following me. You guys can see a lot of this content as well over there. Let me just fix this a little bit. A part of the reason why I'm also reading this paper too is because the brethren gassed him up, who appears on Saturday Night Shoot the Breeze. He once asked that question, like, what is nationhood to the African? What if the African just wants to farm his yam and eat his pounded yam and goosey soup and all that stuff? What if that's just what he wants to do and doesn't want to do more? And that's an important question. We are on the outside of the continent. We believe in, nation, an African nation, African power that rivals the other powers and nations around her, right? But in reality, what does the person on the continent really want? And is it our job too? Should we think of it that way? That we're supposed to go to the continent and push this ideology of nation and powers and all that on African folks? And it's a pretty interesting thing to think about. When you expand your mind to not just the things you believe in, but also keeping in mind what others might be interested in. It's a really interesting question. Let me share the PDF with you guys. Hold on. So here's the PDF. African Nationalism, Concept or Confusion by Robert Rotberg. Well, you know that Rotberg, you know what that is. In common usage, African nationalism is descriptive shorthand for an assembly of separate and distinct phenomena, some of which have already taken on the protective coloring of popular understanding. Africans generally agree that they have experienced nationalism. They know the tree of nationalism when they see it and have tasted some, at least, of its fruits. For many of them, and for students of recent African events, its manifestations are obvious, although the quality of its spirit remains, like most spirits, capable only of inexact description. It is, in essence, pretty much what it is. Skeptics and critics are, however, entitled to seek greater precision. Since Africa historically possessed few nations in the classical European cultural, linguistic, or religious sense, and since few now exist in such terms, how can we write and speak of nationalism? The mere expression of anti-colonial hostility clearly does not provide sufficient proof of its existence. In a tropical African setting, the descriptive usage of nationalism dates only from the late 1940s. For hostile critics, it thus seems nonsensical to assign to nationalism a long African history roughly parallel to the period of colonial intervention. Yet that is one hypothesis, the testing of which depends on a large extent upon a definition of terms. Nation, nationality, and nationalism are catchwords that have been used to describe a multitude of situations, human conditions, and states of mind. I need not here rehearse the relevant literature. We all know the different uses to which nationalism has been put and the inability of the various definitions adequately to depict each of the particular situations. Nationalism is a morass of misapplication. It describes much in general and little in particular. How do you guys feel about that statement there? It describes much in general and little in particular. To add African narrows the area of example but complicates the search for comparative generality. we cannot really approach the subject without knowing what it is and how it relates to similar experiences at other times and in other parts of the world. So this guy is from Harvard University. Nation has historical association. In pre-19th century Western Europe, the growth of monarchical power and the consequent establishment of centralized states in turn brought about the creation of the nations from which nationality and nationalism flowed. Although the emergence of national cultures did not everywhere, although the emergence of national cultures did not everywhere in Europe depend upon the prior establishment of political unity, such unity may almost be considered a necessary precondition. By the end of the 17th century, the monarchical quest for power had involved the bourgeoisie, as well as the dynastic aristocracy. The monarchs had invoked and, in many cases, manufactured national sentiments they had, largely in order to satisfy the designs of their own statecraft, subordinated, feudal, ecclesiastical, communal, and numerous other centers of control to the overriding needs of what came to be called a national design. Monarchs hardly conjured nations from nothing. As the power of the centralized state grew, it both fed upon and nurtured the parallel growth of linguistic and cultural unity. Monarchs conscripted, taxed, and educated their subjects. Let me read that again. Monarchs conscripted, taxed, and educated their subjects. Such actions assisted the spread of an often already existing vernacular while encouraging a new appreciation of the national culture. In writing in this way, I telescoped the almost imperceptible changes that took decades to achieve and longer to notice. Nevertheless, by the middle of the 18th century, the nation was an accepted form. It referred generally to a definite territory that was inhabited by a people who possessed a distinctive common culture and language and who felt that they constituted a nation. The concept of nationality, that is, the state of quality of being to a nation, naturally followed, and nationalism, if the word were used at all, continued to possess a very narrow connotation. During the 18th century in Europe, politicians increased commercial and ideological intercourse, intensified the relationships of hitherto isolated cities and provinces, means of communication and transport improved, and the institutional responsibilities of the state correspondingly grew more complex and important. Individuals became less self-sufficient. They depended more and more upon the efforts of others, particularly of groups of fellow nationals, and on the nation itself as the embodiment of their effort. Let me read that sentence again. Individuals became less self-sufficient. They depended more and more upon the efforts of others, particularly of groups of fellow nationals, and on the nation itself as the embodiment of their effort. As they depended, so they developed loyalties. As they depended, so they developed loyalties. Nationality acquired greater status. Governments, conversely, became to a degree of the people as well as by the king. The people, quote unquote, were generally propertied, and especially in Western Europe, the bourgeoisie were the principal medium for the spread of nationalistic sentiments. They thought of themselves as nationals, although some still considered themselves equally Christians and say Burgundians. But these events would have comparatively little meaning for our study of African nationalism if they had not been overtaken in Western Europe by a widespread consciousness among the literate, and sometimes among the masses, that the nation was a common enterprise that deserved to be run by all the nationals or their middle-class representatives. This flowed from the gradual erosion of parochial ties and the growth and acceptance of the idea, skeptics will call it the myth, of a national culture. So, right there, I'll ask you guys the question. Is national culture a myth? to you guys who are listening to me. Is the idea of a national culture a myth? In other words, is there not a national culture in Jamaica? Is there not one in the Bahamas? Is there not one in Ghana, Nigeria? Is it a myth or not? You guys let me know. I'll read your comments live on the air. Worship of the state became acceptable. Nationalism provided an ideology to which people, usually of the middle class, seeking an escape from the old oppressions of church or monarch, or even from the foreign rule, could devote their efforts in the hope of obtaining liberty. It was the feeling of which revolutions were made. Out of the passion of revolution and the blood of war, men espoused and spread the gospel of nationalism. This became the credo of an age when men throughout Europe and America sought to sunder the chains that deprived them of their freedom. Nationalism eclipsed previous political emotions. Nationalists fought for the liberty of the oppressed everywhere. The new religion of nationhood easily gained converts. A new priesthood developed of the ambitious and the forward-looking. The fervor of the French and American revolutions stimulated others to seek the ecstasy of a national religion. I like how I actually like how he's putting this here. I like this. I kind of like how he's putting it. I see Mr. Untouchable is here saying good night to everyone. The pro-black perspective answered that question. He says, hard to say that there's a national culture. Seems there are local cultures that vary. So you wouldn't say that Jamaica has a national culture, or Mr. Untouchable, he's from the Bahamas. You wouldn't say that there's a national culture. And for us, it's even harder to say because there's so much different islands, and different islands do things slightly differently. But yeah, that's an interesting thing, right? In this way, the nation symbolized relief from oppression. The nation seemed to enshrine and to incorporate the idea of liberty. Yet the religion of nationalism had its component churches. In England, France, what became Germany, the United States, and Haiti, for example, the character and content of the devotion differed. Despite such variations, however, nationalism remained an answer to oppression, since a nation, which was far more than the sum of its individual citizens, by its very existence, promised a better future to people possessing common cultural traits who live within its by now well-defined borders. By extension, peoples everywhere deserve to enjoy the better future, the quote-unquote New Jerusalem. It is from such revolutionary roots that the notion of national self-determination stems. The martial experience of the 19th century enriched the ethos of nationalism and gave birth to new nations at the same time as the older nation states steadily made of still somewhat disparate peoples citizens who owed loyalties primarily to the national will. As Greeks, Germans, Italians, and others discovered their common cultural roots and rebelled and fought in order to recover their liberty, so Britons and Frenchmen and Germans, Italians, and others constructed the railways, roads, and canals that encouraged further unity. Telegraph and telephone lines followed. Common currencies were assumed. Sometimes a customs union enhanced political attempts to achieve geographical or cultural unity. As men of ambition found their own elevation in the promotion of nationalism and national ends, so the pace of this natural process accelerated. By the end of the century, Westerners assumed that nations and nationalism were the most complete embodiments of a natural human need. Let me read that sentence again. By the end of the century, Westerners assumed that nations and nationalism were the most complete embodiments of a natural human need. When Black people's African folks talk about nationalism, is it so that they can have this feeling of of the most complete embodiments of natural human need? Is that what Africans, Black equals African people are? You know, in the chat, we have some discussion here. The pro-Black perspective responds to me, says, I think in Jamaica, Kingston and Maypen are very different. Okay. We have someone called DC Washington President, okay, who asked the question, what's the difference between African nationalism and socialism for Africa? Mr. Untouchable answers that question. He says, nationalism is about land. Socialism is deciding what to do with it. I like that answer. Thank you for that, Mr. Untouchable. Pro-Black perspective continues and says, in America, Detroit, New York, and Texas are different. That's true. And Albany and Manhattan and the Bronx and Brooklyn are different. And okay, we get it. And Bed-Stuy, Brownsville, Midwood, and Bensonhurst are different. So I guess what I'm trying to say too is, or trying to understand too is, like, there's differences, right? But there's a lot of similarities too. They're not like 1 versus 100 different. You know, like for like a big discussion that you'll see is like Chicago pizza versus New York pizza. You'll hear D Webb talk about that, who's from Chicago originally. And but like if you go to Chicago, honestly, if you go into the city of Chicago, it's almost just like Manhattan, right? I get that there'll be some variations, but isn't there a common thread that passes through? So like, I'm not familiar with Jamaica, but isn't there a common thread between Kingston and Maypen? And is that common thread, is that the national culture? That's the question I'm trying to really get down to. Yeah, we know that there'll be variations just by differences in geography. There'll be variations, right? There's differences between Eleuthera and Nassau, but there's some common threads there, right? That's what I'm getting at. And I think that common thread is what is actually the national culture, right? You guys post your thoughts on that, and I'll read them in a few. By the end of the century, Westerners assumed that nations and nationalism were the most complete embodiments of a natural human need. They could conceive of few other positive ways by which the lives of individuals might be organized. Revolutionary nationalism diffused an ideology, and the actions of national governments unified relatively homogeneous peoples. On the basis of the European experience, states began to presuppose definite nationalities. Nationalism came to mean the consciousness on the part of individuals or groups of their membership of a nation and or the desire to further the liberty or purpose of a particular nation. Let me read that again. Nationalism came to mean the consciousness on the part of individuals or groups of their membership of a nation and or the desire to further the liberty or prosperity of a particular nation. And a nationalist in the English language generally wanted to further the interests of a particular established or submerged nation. Right? You guys could respond if you agree with those definitions or not. Such definitions, abbreviated as they must be, suffice for much of Western Europe, but they blur our understanding of the older Latin American and more recent Middle Eastern and Asian revolutions. And if we let ourselves become carried away by their seeming good sense, the definitions also obscure the meaning of the African experience. Pre-colonial tropical Africa had very few nations in the accepted sense, and even fewer that retained their national identity intact throughout the colonial interlude. The colonies themselves usually comprised two or more, often many more, tribal and political entities. In the ordinary sense of our definition, none of these colonies were nations. They were demonstrably not of one people. How then can we talk of the rise of African nationalism, as the self-assertion of African colonial peoples is usually described, and moreover intend that phrase to encompass a time span of 4 or 5 decades? If we compare the African experience with that of one of the older non-European examples, many similarities are apparent. In India, Britain provided the first common national government. It defended the frontiers and gave the subcontinent its first common measure of internal security. The British Raj furthermore provided common communications, laws, and although this is debatable, a common language. It unified India physically, and of perhaps greatest relevance, gave Indians common aspirations and a sense of a common destiny. It is really unimportant for our purposes that colonial India became two independent nations. At least they both owe their existence as separate entities to the British experience. Britain created India of many kingdoms and principalities. We might call them proto-nations in much the same way as, together with France, it destroyed the Pan-Arabia that might have emerged from the Ottoman collapse, and in its place substituted Iraq, Transjordan, etc. By their very presence, the alien powers, and conceptually being alien is more important than Western or European, made the indigenous quote-unquote nationals more conscious than before that they were one people. They organized the states, propagated ideals that were of supposedly universal application, and without necessarily meaning to impose the physical and ideological framework within which the ruled could survive against their rulers. Without the partition and subsequent colonial rule of tropical Africa by the powers of Europe, there might have been no African nationalism. And that's kind of why this line is kind of why I finally decided to actually use this paper. I want to hear you guys' thoughts on that. Without the partition and subsequent colonial rule of tropical Africa by the powers of Europe, there might have been no African nationalism. Do you guys agree or disagree with that thought? Is that something you guys agree with or disagree? You guys drop your comments. I'll read them live on the air. And again, I want to thank you guys for tuning in on a Tuesday night. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you hit the like button before we leave here tonight. Achieve Mindset is in the room. He says socialism is about confusion. Peace to Achieve Mindset. Mr. Untouchable earlier said, I'm curious of whether he considers Jerusalem a nation, or does he describe Theodor Herzl a small hat nationalist? Let's continue reading. But I'd like to hear you guys' thought on that line right there. Without the partition and subsequent colonial rule of tropical Africa by the powers of Europe, there might have been no African nationalism. Were it not so often denied, there would be little point in stating the obvious, that the colonial powers alone created the basis of the present nations of independent Africa by arbitrarily dividing the continent into administrative entities and imposing thereupon imported legal, linguistic, and cultural concepts. This is not to say that the colonial powers completed the nation-building process. In most areas, the independent rulers must now strive to complete the unfinished national designs left to them by their previous rulers. But in the sense of the 18th and 19th century Europe, the colonial territories had become nations of intent. The process of unification indeed began with the conquest and continued with the detribalization of a territory like Malawi or the Congo. Furthermore, for them, the model of a nation existed as an absolute value. During the colonial interlude, the populations resident within most of the various colonies admittedly possessed no common indigenous culture or language. But colonial domination gave them common experiences, a sense of common history, however brief, and in the manner of India, a common language. They share common grievances. They also live within a single definite territory and admittedly without enthusiasm subjected themselves to the same laws and methods of administration. The Lozi of Zambia may have constituted a nation in some sense before the partition. Afterwards, they were in practice treated like any other member of the colonial community known as Northern Rhodesia. Although it is hard for students of European history to conceive it, the Lozi even began in the manner of the Burgundian Christians who gradually came to think of themselves as above all French, to regard themselves as Northern Rhodesians and British protected persons in addition to being Africans. And Lozi, from the district of, say, Sananga, the Ganda during the colonial interlude may have envisaged a future apart from the greater Uganda. Nearly everywhere else, however, I think Africans, or at least the Africans of influence who cared, sought to satisfy their aspirations within territorial boundaries. Because of the all-embracing nature of the colonial form of government, they very early accepted the idea that their fates were inextricably bound up with the new colonial nations into which they had been born. The sentiment of Pan-Africanism is not new. But as the example of the National Congress of British West Africa shows, even feelings of regional unity have almost always been subordinate to nationalism. Well, let me read that last line again. The sentiment of Pan-Africanism is not new. But as the example of the National Congress of British West Africa shows, even feelings of regional unity have almost always been subordinate to nationalism. If we accept that at some point during the colonial period, the alien administered territories passed into the realm of partial nationhood without losing their dominated status, then the nature of African nationalism really holds no mysteries. In its passionate form, it stems, in some senses, directly from the French and American revolutionary experience, and draws even more upon the sentiments that were operative in, for example, Ireland and India. The role which was played in, say, Eastern Europe and Irish nationalism by a ruling caste with a national consciousness differing radically from that of its subjects was to some degree played in Africa, as in Asia, by men of a strikingly different color, religion, and cultural background, who appeared in the garb of conquerors and masters, who destroyed traditional ways of life and promised, or appeared to promise, to turn all Africans into Black Europeans. Ooh, there's a lot to unpack there. Mr. Untouchable in the chat says they did create African nationalism because the fight was over the control of the land itself. Absolutely, I agree with that. Janelle is here saying good evening. DC Washington president is asking what book is he, I guess that's me, reading from. I'm reading a paper, actually. I'm reading a paper, and the paper has the same name as the title of this episode. If you guys aren't on the Discord, pinned to the top of the chat is the invite link to our Discord server. You can hit me up on there. I'm Koku on there as well, Kokou. Or you can hit me on email. That's down in the description as well. If you want the paper, you can just hit me up and I can give it to you. But this is a research paper that I'm reading, right? Let me continue with the reading. But there's a lot being said here, too, by the way. that I'm going to have to unpack a little bit more down the road. So again, if you if you guys want the paper, by all means, hit me up for it. And let's talk about it some more down in the comment section after this live stream is aired. Writing of Ireland, Shaw expressed the Irish sense of common grievance against the intolerable abomination of English rule. So here's a quote: like democracy, national self-government is not for the good of the people. It is for the satisfaction of the people. One Antonine Emperor, one St. Louis, one Richelieu may be worth 10 democracies in point of what is called good government, but there is no satisfaction for the people in them. These sentiments have often been unconsciously echoed by Africans. Much earlier, Lo Ben Bezalel, a 16th century rabbi, articulated that axioms of self-determination, particularly if we read quote-unquote submerged group for people and creed for God. For him, it was clear that every people has a might of its own and ought not to be subject to any other people, that every people has its natural habitation and a right to live there, and that it must be granted to every people to choose its own God according to its own ideas. Choose its own God according to its own ideas. Okay. Africans, antagonized by the realities of colonial rule, while educated in and aware of the ideals of the European national image, eventually asserted themselves with a patriotic fervor that made real the possibility of national self-determination. But could they be patriots without a patria? Without a common culture? Could they really achieve self-determination on a national basis? I submit that Africans not only could, they did. And the fact that the integrity of formerly colonial, quote-unquote, national borders is everywhere so important is an indication that colonies in the latter stages were well on their way to becoming nations. Their inhabitants, led as in Europe by the ambitious, upwardly mobile, middle-class agitators, manned the proverbial barricades and dumped imaginary tea into the waters of disturbance. They manifested extreme anti-European attitudes. I don't know why I can't read tonight. They manifested extreme anti-European attitudes, which were, in the best tradition, anti-establishment. One could label their feelings racialism, xenophobia, and anti-Europeanism, Africanism, or patriotism. But none is satisfactory. Only by using nationalism can we place the African Revolution where it belongs, squarely in the mainstream of man's long struggle to enter the New Jerusalem of liberty and equality. I think that might kind of answer Mr. Untouchable's earlier question, right? If we agree that the nationalism of Africans was similar in content to the earlier Asian and European nationalisms, and broadly speaking, that virtually from the time of their conquest, the African colonies all were nations in embryo, then the nationalism of Africa need not be conceptually confined, as many wish, exclusively to the wind of change era after World War II. We can demonstrate for most of the areas a series of stages that certainly for me constitute the gradual but nevertheless perceptible rise of different forms of national consciousness. We can discern the three stages that I call awakening, incipient action, and triumph. That's an interesting kind of turn there in the chat. This Untouchable says it's interesting because I agree with some of this man's sentiments, right? Tell me if you still agree now, right? I contend that admittedly, to a greater or lesser degree, nearly all of the ex-colonies of tropical Africa experienced a gradual growth in nationalist sentiment from the time of their annexation by aliens. Yet many would say that we should not confuse the gentle murmurs of early protests with the full-blown aggressive activities of the latter-day revolution. But the hesitant early maneuverings are just as much a part of the total process as the more obvious final phase. Africans possess common grievances and shared the hope of common libertarian aspirations. If we probe sufficiently deeply, as David Kimball has done for Ghana and James Coleman for Nigeria, I think that almost everywhere in tropical Africa, we can demonstrate a geometric continuity of African nationalism and isolate its different stages. With this generalization in mind, let us discuss, for the sake of expository and analytical clarity, the illustrative example of Malawi. All right, so we're going to talk about Malawi for a bit here. If you guys are enjoying the paper, whether you agree or disagree, if you're enjoying the reading, the paper, the content of the paper, just drop a 1 in the chat for me if you enjoy it. What I'm going to do while you guys drop a 1 there, let me do a station ID break, and on the other side, we'll continue and finish the paper.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Have you ever considered joining KWAZ Radio? Each of our hosts shares their unique perspective with you. You might have a perspective that needs to be shared. If that's true, hit us up at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. What are you gonna do? What you gonna do?
All right, much appreciated. We're back. I see I got a nice handful of 1s, so I appreciate that feedback. It lets me know that you guys enjoy this type of content. And what's funny is I got more responses with 1s than YouTube is showing me, or I should say StreamYard is showing me that I have actual viewers right now. But nevertheless, that's neither here nor there, like Mr. Untouchable says. I appreciate you guys for that. Make sure you hit the like button for me. That's helpful. I see we got Marcus McGee here, man. Peace to Marcus McGee. Thanks for coming through. DC Washington president, I wonder if he's or she is still around. So we're going to talk about Malawi now and do a little bit of a study on Malawi. By the time of the coming of the first European missionaries and settlers, the old area of Malawi had been disintegrated by the efforts of African invaders from the south and African slave traders from the east. When the Europeans thus conquered what they called Nyasaland, they found it a comparatively easy task. They met resistance, but of a piecemeal, tribal, rather than a concerted national kind. British armed and officered African soldiers ousted recalcitrant chiefs, pacified their peoples, and over a period of about 15 years subordinated Nyasaland to British administrative and legal ideas. They taxed their subjects, encouraged Africans to make roads and missionaries to open schools and hospitals, and improve the existing methods of communication. So this is where someone like Gaston Up would say, what's wrong with how the Africans were living before? and I'll throw that to you guys. This interruption with this type of efforts by the colonizers, how do you feel about that? Do you feel that there was anything positive in that? Remember, and shout out to the revolutionary matron on her show, The Learning Curve. A few of us, I'm pretty sure Mr. Untouchable was there that night. We heard from some guys from Kenya and Kenyans in the UK who believe that, colonization was a good thing. So I throw that out to you guys here too. Was this interruption a good thing? And was this interruption the beginnings of African nationalism in Malawi? Right. I'll read your comments on the other side. Again, I'm just asking questions to see, what folks' feelings are on these things. Right. British armed and officered African soldiers ousted recalcitrant chiefs, pacified their peoples, and over a period of about 15 years subordinated Nyasaland to British administrative and legal ideas. So this tells you something about some of our folks. They taxed their subjects, encouraged Africans to make roads, and missionaries to open schools and hospitals, and improve the existing methods of communication. They introduced new entrepreneurial and agricultural concepts, eventually constructed a railway, and in various ways hastened the economic development of the protectorate. Such initiatives, particularly the collection of taxes and the consequent need to speak English for the purpose of most wage-earning employment, brought together for the first time a disparate congeries of tribal peoples. There's something about that just feels unseemly right there. Administrative regimentation hastened the process, and the spread of educational facilities, the employment of the peoples of the protectorate in World War I, and the steady migration of labor from the rural to the urban and plantation areas of the protectorate quickened it still faster. By about 1920, the Nyasa Nation, an artificial creation like so many other African states, could be said to exist, however, embryonically. The time spans might differ, but other colonies had similar experiences. So we'll see what the writer says next, but we know that a lot of that stuff that was done was not good for our folks on the continent. And we're still feeling the effects of that today, right? Yeah, you came and you built schools and all that stuff, but everything, including your language that you brought, was about making these folks slaves to these colonial nations, right? Already the tightening grip of the administrative noose, the introduction of modern codes of behavioral expectation, the hard lot of the agricultural laboring class, the spread and intensification of a color bar, and an obvious contempt for and attempt to transform the traditional way of life had turned reluctantly acquiescent subjects into disoriented ones. There was what we might call a nationalist awakening in various parts of the protectorate. The self-assertive message of the millenarian preacher Elliot Keenan Kamwana received a ready response from Africans. A few years later, after the government of Nyasaland had decisively legislated chiefs as a group out of existence, members of the new middle class organized the first Native Association. So I think I'm following where this is going. I think I follow where this is going. Okay, I'll just continue and I'll point it out later. Both types of responses were subsequently to provide important outlets for the expression of nationalistic feeling. Both signified that Africans were not altogether content to remain the subjects of aliens, Both had national ends in mind, but neither their leadership nor their activities were, strictly speaking, national in scope. From the stage of awakening, we move to the stage of incipient action. Usually, this corresponds to the period during which associations were especially active and millenarians found ready adherents. In Malawi, however, there was an intervening stage that shared many of the characteristics of both the stages of awakening and incipient action. John Chilembwe, an American-educated preacher in 1914 to 1915, launched a crusade in order to achieve for his fellow Nyasas the freedom that he thought they deserved. In concert with a number of chiefs and members of the emerging middle class, he viewed with dismay the way in which white employers treated their African plantation labor. He had his own difficulties with settlers, and despite his own independent financial position as the leader of the American-backed Providence Industrial Mission, Chilembwe must himself have shared the experience of racial discrimination with the mass of Africans. But what precipitated the overt expression of his dissatisfaction was the conscription of Nyasas during the opening weeks of World War I. He, like others, failed to see why Nyasas should participate in a war in which they had no stake and from which, if Africans knew whites, Nyasas would receive little improvement in their own hard lot. I like this guy. In fact, I think I've read a paper on here before about him as well. Chilembwe, at the behest of a number of other Nyasas, first adopted one of the standard means of protest. He drew up a petition in the form of an open letter to the national newspaper. In his famous letter, the admittedly westernized preacher aired national grievances and sought specifically national solutions. He wrote as a nationalist and already thought of Nyasaland as a nation and its inhabitants as fellow countrymen. But significantly, he did not so regard the neighboring British protected persons of northern Rhodesia, many of whom spoke the same language as his own people. He responded to the colonial situation in a nationalistic manner that Rabbi Bezalel Shaw and numerous Asians and Arabs would have applauded. In part, Chilembwe's letter read, "We understand that we have been invited to shed our innocent blood in this world's war, which is now in progress throughout the wide world. But will there be any good prospects for the natives after the end of the war? Shall we be recognized as anybody in the best interests of civilization and Christianity after the great struggle is ended? We are imposed upon more than any other nationality under the sun. We have been loyal since the commencement of this government, and no time have we been ever known to betray any trust, national or otherwise, confided to us. For our part, we have unreservedly stepped to the firing line in every conflict and played a patriot's part with the spirit of true gallantry. But in time of peace, everything is for Europeans only. But in time of war, it has been found that we are needed to share hardships and shed our blood in equality. It is even true that there is a spot for our blood in the cross of the Nyasaland government." What does that letter sound like to you guys, man? If you're still here with me, what does that letter sound like to you guys? Doesn't that sound a lot like Tariq Nasheed and the FBA crowd? The crowd that always argues that they've never fought against America. They fought in every world war representing America and all that stuff. Doesn't it sound like that? And to just get that, to get no reward for it at the end, it sounds like the plight of Africans in America. You guys tell me if you think the same. Let me continue. This letter was signed simply John Chilembwe on behalf of his countrymen. Because of the actions of the official censor, few of Chilembwe's countrymen saw the letter. Even if they had, it is hardly to be supposed that it would have evoked a national response. Predictably, the government turned it aside, and Chilembwe and the members of his cabal decided to take more positive steps to air the grievances of their fellow countrymen. Early in 1915, without having made of their own conspiracy a national movement, they rose briefly and abortively against the government of Nyasaland. The African masses, never privy to the conspiracy, remained aloof. Afterwards, there was no overt upsurge of national feeling. The government regarded the rebellion as an aberration. Its only immediate effect was to provide the administrators of the protectorate with an excuse to regard every subsequent manifestation of discontent as the dangerous sedition of revolt. Nonetheless, the Chilembwe Rising marked an extreme example of the influence on Africans, on the middle classes, if no other, of the sentiments that I have been calling nationalistic. Had the rising by some fluke succeeded, and we have already shown that the nationalist prerequisites of success were lacking, Chilembwe would simply, as later nationalists did, have taken over the existing governmental apparatus and adapted it to the needs of his fellow countrymen. We would probably not know, we would probably not now question its nationalist character. Similarly, had the Thuku movement in Kenya somehow brought about the end of British rule in 1921, that too would unquestionably have found a place in the panorama of nationalism. But both of these dramatic failures serve again to remind us that the rise of nationalism has had a long period of gestation. During the years between the two world wars, politically aroused Africans, at first only an articulate minority, almost everywhere occupied the stage of revolutionary nationalism that I have called incipient action. In a few areas, like the Gold Coast, Africans had long before begun to act politically in concert without embarking upon the third and final stage of their affair with colonialism. Elsewhere in Africa, civil servants and teachers formed associations for the first time. Evangelists rebelled against European missionary supervision and established separatist sects. And millennially minded preachers directed their quasi-political attacks against the colonial establishment. Although collectively these themes, often overlooked in the literature of and about the period, may be regarded as but a modest prelude to the triumphant march of the 1940s and 50s, they expressed a dominant sentiment of what I have called nationalism. Africans sought a redress of common grievances within a common territorial framework. Those who thus agitated, if that is the correct word, generally accepted the particular national structure of their aspirations and spoke and acted in terms of programs of national action. Even though few were at this time demanding self-government or even equality of representation in their respective legislative assemblies, their efforts still justify the use of the collective term nationalism. To return to Nyasaland, associational forms of endeavor were obscured by the more immediate events of World War I, the Chilembwe Rising and its aftermath. Immediately after the European armistice, however, civil servants, teachers, evangelists, and small businessmen, with some chiefs and headmen, continued the old and organized a number of new native associations. These groups met to talk political reform, and they may, in an African context, be considered proto-parties. The associations provided convenient platforms for the airing and discussion of grievances, the training of leaders, and experimentation with different techniques of protest. Since the government controlled all the usual methods of communication and could and did prescribe, within certain narrow limits, the forms of overt protests that it considered legit, the associations attempted to accomplish their aims by petitioning the governor, the Secretary of State for the colonies, and the reigning British king by passing innumerable resolutions in the hope that the government would take notice, and by seeking interviews with the governor or other administrative officials in person. But little was accomplished by such means, the government often ignoring the very existence of the association. So are we getting a clearer picture here? Oh, I see Mr. Untouchable had commented earlier. He said, I wish they would have gotten a consensus by the people first before they started moving around their furniture. When you say they got that they would have gotten a consensus, are you talking about the colonial powers, Mr. Untouchable? Or are you talking about the colonial powers? Because we could also extend that to when Africans started to basically carry on the systems of the colonizers, of the colonial powers, and call it independence. We could also say that we wish that they, meaning the Africans in power, would have gotten a consensus by the people first before they started moving around their furniture. You know what I mean? I think that right there is the biggest recent failure of Africans right there. To continue, along with the separatist sects and millennial movements, rural and urban associations existed in almost every part of Nyasaland. Some operated continually, some intermittently, others occasionally. The most important were the district and provincial associations that were composed of the indigenous leaders of the protectorate. Certain members belonged at the same time to two or more associations, others belonged to several in turn. The membership of the various associations overlapped with that of the separatist sects and millennial movements. In certain cases, the leaders were identical. I doubt if any of these associations could ever have counted members or adherents in as many as 4 figures. But no matter how parochial and ineffectual the associations appeared, their thoughts and their actions expressed more than tribal or individual interests. They talked in terms of the Nyasan nation. Few then spoke of Malawi and accepted the integrity of its colonial-derived borders. There's a question in there, but I think I'll just leave that one be. To continue. To name only a few of the more prominent association leaders, Charles Chinula, George Mowasi, Levi Mumba, James Sangala, and Issa MacDonald Lawrence, much as they desired governmental reforms, all expressed a loyalty to the abstract nation of Nyasaland that had much in common with the feelings of nationality accepted by the middle class in, say, 18th century France. Both, when the time came to feel and express their nationalism, followed the lead of the more advanced bourgeoisie. It was distinctly in the interest of the nascent bourgeoisie to keep alive and promote the cause of nationalism, and in Nyasaland, several among their numbers finally realized that they could never hope to redress grievances of national concern if the voice of African protest were to continue to be expressed by many scattered sounds rather than by one united chorus that could claim and in time achieve a national following. Out of this sense of the national need emerged the Nyasaland African Congress, an organization of associations and individuals that held its inaugural meeting in 1944. Sangala, its founder, professed national aims. The speeches and resolutions of the first few meetings reflected similar ends. In the past, grievances and other vital matters affecting the country and people have been presented to the government and or other authorities by local organizations who were interested only in their local worries. It is considered the Congress decided that the time is ripe now for the Africans in this country to strive for unity so as to obtain the greater development of the peoples and country of Nyasaland. But in terms of methods and accomplishments, the Congress retained an aura reminiscent of its predecessor associations. Only the attempt by white settlers to gain an overwhelming control of the destinies of the indigenous inhabitants of Central Africa by federating Nyasaland and the two Rhodesias provided an issue that could arouse the most apathetic tribesmen and give the Congress's national aspirations the mass appeal of a full-fledged movement of nationalism. Without taking space here to discuss the unsuccessful campaign against the Federation and the political strategies of the time, suffice it to say that Nyasaland entered the stage of triumphant nationalism when chiefs and members of the Congress together devoted all their energies to destroying the edifice of federation. At first, under leaders who had gained their experience during the politically tentative days before World War II, the Congress proved unable to take advantage of the growing anti-government sentiment in the countryside. But from about 1955, under a group of impressively tough-minded young men, and after 1958, under the overall direction of Dr. H. Kamuzu Banda, the Congress opened branches and gained paid-up adherents everywhere. They maneuvered themselves by the end of 1958 into a sufficiently strong position to challenge the governments of Nyasaland and the Federation openly, to defy their laws, and to precipitate a state of unrest that became a state of emergency and resulted in their own imprisonment. Nationalism, in its most obvious form, had achieved results of a kind that led a few years later to the achievement of self-government and finally to the independence of Malawi. To generalize, with adjustments to the outline that I have sketched for Malawi, most of tropical Africa has exhibited this threefold timescale of nationalism. Kenya, Zambia, Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, Togo, the Congo, and Gabon appear to confirm the paradigm. Depending upon how the terms are defined, Uganda and Sudan fit as well. Tanzania, with a certain allowance for time lag, also meets the criteria that I have sketched. The Congo provides an example of extreme telescoping, and many other nations seem to fall in between. But we know comparatively little about tropical Africa in the years between the two world wars. A close examination of the events of those years would, I think, substantiate my contention that the rise of African nationalism is no recent phenomenon, that in most parts of tropical Africa it possesses roots that reach deep into the oldest colonial soil, and that we can conveniently divide the tree of nationalism into the three branches of awakening, incipient action, and triumph. I would be the last to say that the mere achievement of independence by a territory concludes the working of the ethos of nationalism within it. For only a few parts of independent Africa can we say that the process of nation building has been completed. This paper is from the mid-1960s. Is that statement still true today? Almost everywhere, the new rulers, inheriting the problems that colonial administrations were either unwilling or not equipped to face, are involved in a difficult struggle to finish the process of unification that began almost at the beginning of the colonial era. Despite the overwhelming support given to the nationalist movement by Africans of all classes during the final phases of the struggle, and the fervor that the movement aroused in the hearts of its supporters, who thus became the relevant nationals, the present-day rulers have inherited only unconsolidated nations. As in early America, so in Africa, there remain fissiparous social, economic, and psychological forces that must be overcome before we can say that the colonial nations have survived the shocks of independence. To summarize, I see African nationalism in historical terms. For me, it has qualities reminiscent of the older nationalisms of Europe, Arabia, and Asia, despite the number of putative peoples and distinctive languages that exist within each territorial boundary. I maintain that the policies and practices of the colonial powers created national entities of their arbitrarily contrived and assigned territories, and that the indigenous inhabitants not only came to accept their status as nationals, but they began to think almost exclusively in terms of achieving their freedom from alien rule within the parameters of their colonial existence. Within almost every territory, the nationalist spirit found ready vessels. Its success owes much to the techniques and experiences of the older nationalisms, As hot wars loosened the grip of colonial control in Latin America, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, so the Cold War assisted the progress and made possible the success of the nationalist movements of tropical Africa. So again, I asked a question. After we went through all of that, the question is, and it's on the community tab, is African nationalism a legit concept or just confusion? What say you guys? I'm going to do a station ID break. On the other side, I'll read your comments. You guys, if you don't mind, give me a comment to that question or comment to that question on the community tab as well. I could read it from there also. So let's do the station ID break. Let me remind you guys that I am a part of a podcast network. There are other shows you should be tuning to, and you should really be tuning into the Pro-Black Perspectives. That Sunday segment he's doing now, The Enemies Within, that's a really good segment. So you guys should be tuned in to it.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron, on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
All right. And I didn't get any comments. I just the Pro-Black says, appreciate that, fam. Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. It's a good segment. You guys should be tuning into that on Sundays. The Pro-Black Perspective says, I think nationalism can become something, but most of us are imitating Whitey. We notice this as kids too. Talk about that a little bit more if you don't mind. But yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing. And I think that's kind of what gassed him up was talking about on Shoot the Breeze a couple weeks back. That what does it look like? And a lot of us tend to, and especially those African leaders in the early days of independence, 50s and 60s, like a lot of them just copied what they saw. You know what I mean? They just copied what they saw. Over on the community tab, I got a couple of votes in. On the community tab, I asked a question. Question of the day, is African nationalism a legit concept or just confusion? 100%, 2 votes, but 100% people say it's legit. What does it look like, though? And I think that's the follow-up question to that. So you might see me actually post that tomorrow on the community tab, if not tonight. What does it really look like? You understand? But I like Oni's comment here. I think nationalism can become something, but most of us are imitating Whitey. We notice this as kids. We notice this as kids, though, right? It's what they call black mirroring, right? So that's the paper tonight. I want to thank all of you who took time to come out, listen, drop comments, etc., likes. Thanks for coming through. I'll be back again. Well, we'll definitely be back for Shoot the Breeze. I already see the Discord has a lot of topics being posted for Shoot the Breeze for Saturday. They look pretty good so far. So I look forward to Shoot the Breeze. I hope you look forward to Shoot the Breeze on Saturday as well. Come through, bring your peoples. Let's have a good time of it. And until then, if I don't do a Thursday show, I'll see you guys on Saturday. Until that time, you guys be good. I'll see you guys later. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, We hope you pass along our web address, bitamedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Beta Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Beta Medicine Show, Twitter, Beta Meds, Tumblr, Beta Meds, Instagram, Beta Medicine.